Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto and Sasuke became friends at a young age. Will Naruto's paranoia and mental instability draw Sasuke down into madness, or will Sasuke's own demons bring them both into the dark? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 10. The residual laughter in his head had faded to an acceptable hum, along with the headache, enough that Naruto managed to lift his head from the floor and turn his body over, for he had spent the night staring at the wall in his corner. The room was empty. Sasuke had spent the evening downstairs, leaving him with them as his sole company, and oftentimes he wondered which was worse. He hated it when Sasuke laughed, hated it the way he hated everything else, because when the dark-haired boy showed such delight, it meant that he had things planned for him, things he knew he didn't want to be a part of but had no choice. He sat up, his whole body burning, like his very veins were on fire, and he groaned as he slowly got to his feet, pulling on a sweater. Despite his pain and misery, he knew that things had to be clean, couldn't leave the house until things were done the way they should be, and so he limped down the stairs and into the kitchen, which smelled strongly of coffee. Sasuke was sitting at the table, pale face staring at the newspapered window in silent contemplation, a mug sitting comfortably in his left hand. The right side of his face sported bruising from cheek to chin, and there were cuts along his hands, but beyond that, he seemed fine. The table had been replaced by another, most likely a old spare judging by the chipped edges. Moving to the sink, he pulled his cleansers out of the cabinet and got to work, all the while feeling Sasuke's eyes on him. When he finished his cleaning, which took him even longer due to his aching body and lack of Bunshin to help, he took a shower, sluggish mind rolling over what had happened yesterday. They had given him their chakra, or more like, Kyuubi had, as he understood it. He'd never been given anything from them before, but he knew that Kyuubi had such chakra, and it was the first time it had rushed through his chakra coils it had burned. Naruto put on a fresh sweater and pants, glancing at himself in the mirror before quickly averting his eyes. He didn't like mirrors. He returned to the kitchen and was dismayed to see a bowl of soup at his spot, like it usually was. He really didn't feel like eating something so heavy today, but he knew Sasuke would be adamant that he eat. Sitting down at the table, he slowly slurped the soup, and for the first time, he contemplated the state of his own mind. He had never put much thought into them, they had simply existed from day one. But now, after the incident from yesterday, he was left to wonder, was Kyuubi the only one in his head, or were there truly others residing within his cranium? It had always been we and us, but what if it was really just I and me? What if all the other voices were just a figment of his imagination, and only Kyuubi was real? What if Kyuubi was making him think there was more inside him than there really was? Naruto carefully placed the spoon on the table, his hands sporting a fine tremor as he slowly pushed the bowl away from him. He shouldn't be surprised, really. It's not like he expected anyone to be nice to him or anything, and yet his eyes clouded with tears. What is it? Sasuke's voice startled him, and he looked up to see that his companion was looking about the kitchen from his spot at the table. Is it my mother? Is she here? Sasuke's dark eyes turned on him with such intensity that he flinched, wiping his eyes as he sent a nervous glance around the kitchen, shaking his head. Sasuke slowly put the coffee mug down on the table and leaned back into the chair, his eyes surveying the blonde. Okay, so tell me, are there dead people around here? Naruto swallowed nervously. He didn't want to talk of such things, didn't like to share his private piece of hell with Sasuke, but the other boy looked like he would start to threaten if he said nothing, so he nodded minutely, wishing that this would satisfy the Uchiha. But he was sorely mistaken. Instead, Sasuke looked more intrigued as he stood up. Okay, show me. He gestured for him to follow as he headed for the door, sporting a slight limp. Naruto sighed and followed the Uchiha outside, smoothing down his hood and squinting into the sunlight. Sasuke stood on the porch, arms crossed, eyes darting around the compound. Where are they? There were several of them out, the woman with the baby, one man hobbling on a porch, and several others, all were staring at them. Naruto pointed in their direction, and Sasuke's eyes zeroed in on them. But his face showed no horror. He turned his head and looked at him, and Naruto blinked back. What do they look like? Naruto sighed. Clearly Sasuke wasn't going to let this go, and he mourned his weakness in screaming about Sasuke's mother. The man on the porch is missing a leg and arm. He is there all the time. The woman is holding her baby. He pointed to the hedge where she sat. She is crying. Sasuke stared at the hedge, eyes empty of emotion, then looked back at him. My mother? She say anything to me? Naruto blanched and took a step away from him. She roars and weeps. Sasuke took a step forward, eyes burning. And my father? Naruto shook his head rapidly and averted his eyes, but Sasuke knew him too well. You've seen him. He grabbed Naruto's arm. Where is he? Which part of the Hodesh? Sasuke's eyes darkened until they nearly looked black, and he marched into the house, dragging Naruto along with him, heading towards that room, the room he never entered. Terror grew in him. He did not want to see that man again, and he latched his arm onto a doorway, jerking Sasuke and his arm to a stop. Sasuke turned to him, eyes seeming on fire, and he bodily yanked Naruto from the doorway and pushed him toward the room. No, Sasuke! He cried, trying to dart away from the Uchiha, but Sasuke threw him back toward the door. When were you going to tell me that you see my family, huh? Sasuke looked downright murderous. He grabbed Naruto's arm with a bruising grip as his other hand began to slide open the door. Sometimes Naruto, he hissed, lips pulled back with a snarl. Sometimes you remind me of him. The door slammed open, and the musty smell of an unused room assaulted their noses. Sasuke pulled him into the room, and they stood before the blood stain smeared across the floor, and Naruto stared in dread at the man sitting there, dark, cold eyes focused on Sasuke. Is he in here, Naruto? Do you see him? Sasuke's voice had a breathy quality to it, but it was nothing compared to Naruto, who was trying hard not to hyperventilate. Tell me the truth, Naruto. Sasuke shook him by the arm. Is he here? Naruto nodded, eyes moving toward the man, and Sasuke followed his line of vision. Father. The man blinked once, a slow blink, and his eyes seemed almost colder than before. You were always a disappointment, boy. His tone was laced with disdain, purple and brown puffs escaping with his words, and Naruto felt a wave of nausea run through him. Did he say something? Sasuke demanded eagerly, and Naruto nodded. What did he say? He said he's counting on you to avenge the clan. Naruto looked directly at Sasuke, swallowing thickly. He said you're the last member, and that you have a duty. He could see that Sasuke was eating up his words like a starving man, and his arm was going numb from his grip. Can we go now, please? This is a bad place, let's just go, we have missions to do. Sasuke turned to the man, his eyes looking through him, and bowed respectively. Of course, father. I will not rest until Itachi is dead. The man's lip curled in disgust, and his eyes turned on Naruto. You're a filthy creature, demon. You weave your lies like a master, and no doubt you have this fool wrapped around your clawed fingers. Take him from my sight. He looks satisfied. Naruto breathed quickly, trying to pull himself from the room. Sasuke was still bowing. Sasuke, let's go. Sasuke straightened from his bow and proceeded to leave, releasing him, and as Naruto jumped from the room, was horrified when he came face to chest with Sasuke's mother. Her dark eyes were wide and swollen with tears, and as her mouth opened, that black cavern, Naruto gave a shriek and dashed around her and out of the house, heart pounding in his ears, breath coming wild. He stood on the road, breathing hard as the Uchiha that milled about turned and stared at him. And for quite some time, he hated Sasuke. Kakashi leaned against the railing of the bridge, book open as he surveyed the area. It had been a while since Sasuke and Naruto had been late, and he wondered what could be keeping them. He glanced at Sakura, who was combing her fingers through her hair, but staring down at the cobbled ground with a pensive look on her face. He shut the book and stuffed it in his back pocket just as he sighted the boys approaching. What is it, Sakura? Something bothering you? Sakura glanced up at him, her green eyes wary, but she shrugged. It's nothing. I'm just tired of doing His voice trailed off as her eyes fell on the approaching boys, and her face blanched, causing Kakashi to turn and look at them. He raised his brows in alarmed surprise. Sasuke was sporting a slightly swollen bruise on the right side of his face, his eyes were shadowed as if he hadn't slept, and he was walking with a clear limp. But it was Naruto that was most alarming. The boy's skin was almost ghostly white, which made the deep angry bruising coloring his mouth and cheeks to look extra ugly. The closer he got, the nastier it looked, until he was close enough that Kakashi realized that it wasn't just regular bruising, but there was actually bleeding beneath his skin, coloring his lips, part of his chin, and most of his cheeks, red and purple. He too was limping, in a frail, almost weak way, and the expression on his face he looked like he was about to be ill. Both boys stopped before them, and Naruto's hand lifted and smoothed down his hood, and he caught a glimpse of Naruto's fingers and they too sported the bruising. What happened? Sakura sounded aghast, her eyes darting between both boys like they had grown extra heads. Naruto only sniffed in reply, and Sasuke looked embarrassed. Training went a little too far, he shrugged, and looked over into the river, purposely avoiding their gazes. Kakashi looked at Naruto, who was staring sickly at the ground. He looked back at Sasuke suspiciously. He didn't know what kind of training they were doing, but if this was the result, apparently they needed supervision. But he didn't believe that these were training wounds, this was something else, and it was clear that whatever had gone on between the two of them, Naruto had come out the worst of it. You guys are going to have to be more careful, or you won't be in any condition to do missions, he admonished, but he knew he would be keeping a closer eye on the two from now on. They headed to the tower, and both boys garnered alarmed looks from people passing by, and he noticed that Sakura walked closer to him than the boys, shooting them wary, contemplative looks. Ninja stared as they headed to receive a mission from the Hokage, and both he and Umino-san looked rather stunned by the boy's appearance. For a moment there was an awkward silence, and then Umino-san sputtered, "Na Naruto. What happened to your face?" Naruto, who had been staring at the floor, darted his eyes up at the man, then down at the floor. "Training," he muttered, and his voice was barely a rasp, broken and barely completing the word, and Kakashi knew voices that sounded like that. Victims of torture, people who had screamed until their vocal cords gave out and their throats bled. His eyes narrowed, along with Umino-san's and the Hokage's. Their eyes darted to Sasuke, who scowled. He screwed up with the Kagebunshin is all, he snapped, and at this Naruto nodded. Sandaime raised his brows in surprise. Who taught him that? He looked at Kakashi as he waved his hand lazily, then scratched his ear. It's really been useful to him, he said, but frowned at the boys, though I don't know what he could have done to harm himself that bad. His frown let Sasuke know that he didn't entirely believe his words. From his side, Sakura watched them all with wide green eyes, taking everyone's reaction in. I see, and the Hokage seemed to understand his meaning. He sifted through the stacks of paper, pulling out a mission. We're tired of doing D missions, Sasuke blurted out suddenly, his eyes moving to Sakura, who nodded quickly and turned beseeching eyes on the Hokage. Can't we get a higher mission? Sandaime puffed on his pipe, eyes surveying the team, then glancing at Kakashi, who shrugged. All right, I suppose I may have one for you, he sorted through the papers and pulled one out. An escort mission to Wave Country, he handed the scroll to Kakashi, who opened it and looked it over. You're to escort a bridge builder back home, and keep him safe from possible threats such as bandits. He leaned over and requested that Umino-san bring the man. Moments later, an elderly man about 60-ish entered, reeking of alcohol and dirt. He scratched his scraggly goatee and stared at his team. Are you serious? His voice grumbled. They're going to protect me. He looked at the Hokage incredulously as the man nodded. These are babies. And one of them looks like he needs to be hospitalized. They can't protect me. Both Sasuke and Sakura glared at him. Naruto was playing deaf and continued to stare at the floor. They're a very good team, Kakashi assured the man, and I'll also be protecting you. You have nothing to fear. The man looked at him suspiciously before sighing. All right, but I'm leaving in 2 hours. He stalked toward the door. Meet me at the west gate. Kakashi nodded and turned to his team as the man exited. Go home and pack up, it's going to take us some time to get to Wave, especially at that man's pace. Bring what you will. Both nodded, and quickly exited the room, Naruto following after at a sluggish, clearly reluctant pace. They watched as he disappeared out of the room before turning to each other. Do you believe him? The Hokage asked, eyes stern. Kakashi sighed and scratched his scalp. Yes, and no. He looked at Umino-san, whose eyes were trained on the doorway. What do you think, Umino-san? The man looked at him and sighed. Sasuke really looked out for Naruto back in the academy, and I've seen Naruto inflict harm upon himself, twice. But I'm going to have to agree with you, I believe Sasuke, but only to a certain extent. I don't think it's safe for them to be alone together. You said there was a regression in Sasuke after he had taken up with Naruto, Kakashi prompted, and the Chunin nodded. I was worried from the get-go about Sasuke once he returned to the academy after the massacre, but, being with Naruto, Umino frowned and shook his head. It's strange and I can't quite explain it, but it seemed as if everyone stopped existing for the boy. Like I wrote in my assessment, they both seemed to exist in their own world. His eyes had a distant cast to them, as if he were remembering their time at the academy. I swear, sometimes when he looked at me when I spoke to him, it was like I wasn't really there to him, there was always a delay before he would respond. He sighed. And Naruto never spoke or looked at me at all. He shrugged and looked at the Hokage, who had leaned back in his chair, smoking his pipe and looking very thoughtful. Umino looked back at him. How was their interaction with Yoshina? Kakashi sighed. They tolerated her. They weren't rude, and they didn't exclude her, but then, you stuck three very antisocial kids together. Not much happened. And Sakura? Sakura is very social, and it's clear she's getting on their nerves some, but it's working out better than I thought. This mission may do some good or it may not. The Hokage sighed. Have I made a mistake? Or perhaps this is the lesser of two bad outcomes. They returned to the compound, Sasuke looking eager and excited as he entered the house and headed for the room, pulling out their packs and stuffing a change of clothing, a first aid kit, and then headed down into the kitchen for food. Naruto slowly filled his pack, putting in clothing and wipes, because he knew he wouldn't be taking a shower anytime soon. The mere thought of walking around for days and being dirty made him nauseous. When he went downstairs, Sasuke had the kunai and shuriken laid out across the table, and he gestured for Naruto to take some. They geared up, and he was relieved to see that Sasuke had packed his candy bars for him. The idea of eating anything else was making him break into a sweat. As they were strapping the katana to their backs, Sasuke's head suddenly snapped up, and his eyes took on that intense look again. Who taught you how to use the katana? Naruto rubbed his eyes as a headache bloomed. Nabeshin. Sasuke's eyes deepened as he seemed to try to remember who Nabeshin was, but apparently failing to, judging by the look of frustration on his face. Show me where he is. They finished up, locked the house, and Sasuke followed him as he went to the building Nabeshin tended to wander about. The ghost was not there, however, and he simply stood there, staring emptily at the building. Sasuke frowned. Is he here? Naruto shook his head. Sasuke stared at the building for a moment, then spoke. This used to be the infirmary, for when we got sick, or injured, and didn't want to go to the village hospital. A look of wariness passed over his face. I never liked this place. Naruto made no reply, settling for staring at the building and wondering when they would be leaving. Of course, that was when the gravity of what they were about to embark on hit him. They were leaving the village. His face paled. He had never imagined leaving these walls, never dreamt of a place outside of his apartment, and never cared to for that matter, so the very thought, the idea, that they would be going out into a world without walls, suddenly terrified him. I'm sorry, Sasuke's hushed voice jolted him from his fears, and he looked at the dark-haired boy, who was staring at the building, his hands stuffed in his pockets. The Uchiha darted a glance at him from the corner of his eyes, then quickly looked away. I'm sorry, about shoving you and stuff. His face flushed slightly in embarrassment. I was just mad. He looked at him then, and Naruto stared back at him, his face empty of his thoughts. Sasuke shrugged and moved away from the building. Come on, let's go. Naruto followed him through the village, breaking out into a sweat, eyes moving to all the people that passed them by, the walls looming closer and closer. He really didn't want to leave, and yet, they began to stir. He could feel their excitement, like acid running through his veins. They were eager to leave, to be free of Konoha. They arrived at the gates, where a trickle of people wandered in and out, showing passes and goods before entering or exiting. Sakura was standing next to the old man, a slight grimace on her face, a pack on her back and several kunai strapped to her legs. She smiled at them when they approached, but the smile didn't have that vapid infatuation he was used to seeing when it was directed Sasuke's way. It was more reserved now, definitely more wary. The man, Tajuna, scowled at him. "What happened to your face?" "None of your business," Sasuke snapped, and the man turned a glare on him. "I wasn't talking to you," he growled. Sasuke's lip curled up in disdain, much like his father's, Naruto thought. "When you have something to say to him, you speak to me. Don't talk to him." Both Sakura and the man looked incredulous at the Uchiha's words. Tajuna turned to him. "That the way you like things, little boy?" Naruto smoothed his hood down and stared at the looming walls. Actually, that was the way he liked things. He much preferred not to speak to people at all, and if Sasuke was willing to do all the talking for him, then for once, things were actually going his way. The man glared at Sasuke for a while before growling, "Where's that Jonin of yours?" Sakura looked up at him. "He's usually late, though I didn't think he would be late for this." They lapsed into silence for 30 more minutes before Kakashi-sensei showed up, moving at a sedate pace and reading that orange book. His eye surveyed them and he gave a cheerful smile. "We're all here?" "Yes." He handed the mission scroll to the Chunin guarding the gate, who looked it over, made a copy, then handed it back with a few words of good luck. "Okay then, let's go." One by one they followed the Jonin out of the gates, and out of the village, Kakashi-sensei at the fore, Sakura and Tajuna in the middle, and Sasuke and Naruto at the back. They were less than half a mile from the walls when they stirred, unfurled within his mind like a beast. At last, they breathed, and a wave of pure ecstasy rushed through him, all his aches and pains vanished, the air suddenly burst with flavors and scents, and his knees went weak. He felt someone grab his arm, and he realized he was bent over, staring at the ground. "Not now, not now," someone was whispering in his left ear, and his swimming eyes looked up to see Sasuke at his side, gripping his arm and holding him from collapsing to the ground. Ahead, he could see that the others were still walking, not noticing what was happening behind them. Naruto straightened his legs, and took a few steps forward, the sensation fading. "Why are you smiling?" Sasuke's question startled him completely, and he realized that his face was split into a smile. How strange, and as he noticed this, his muscles released, and the smile was gone. Sasuke still had him by the arm as they quickened their pace to catch up to the others, and his face was twisted in a concerned frown. Only moments later, did he release his grip on him, instead dropping his hand down to rest on his katana, which rested at their hips instead of on their backs because of the traveling packs. "If an enemy comes, aim to kill," he murmured, looking Naruto in the eye. "Don't even think about incapacitation because I doubt they'll show you the same courtesy." He sent him a knowing look, and Naruto's eyes widened. "We won't give them a chance." "Right." Naruto's eyes fluttered as they murmured their agreement, and he smoothed down his hood while nodding. "Right." Chapter 11. He had bumped into Sasuke again, for the 4th time, something he couldn't help, being that it was his first time outside of the village, and he was as twitchy as a squirrel. Both his and Sasuke's hands were resting on their katana, ever alert for some kind of attack that was sure to come, while Sakura tried to conduct a conversation with the outsider man, Tajuna. Every once in a while she would glance back at them, and he wasn't sure if it was to reassure herself that they were still there, or her way of keeping an eye on them. She definitely looked wary enough, something that alarmed him deeply. Did she have some type of plan? What was behind all of the speculative glances she turned their way? Kakashi-sensei began to linger back, until he was near them, his lazy eye taking everything in, and that was when Naruto noticed a puddle on the ground, not at all significant by his standards, but they surged forward in his mind to the fore, until they were looking out at the puddle, and he could see 2 ninjas hidden within. Naruto blinked rapidly, his eyes feeling like they were about to pop from the force of them, opened his mouth to speak, but the 2 hidden ninja exploded into action. Chains flew from the puddle, wrapping around their startled sensei as the 2 ninja emerged from the puddle. "One down," one of the half-masked men hissed as both pulled on the chains in opposite directions, ripping Kakashi-sensei to shreds. They cackled in his mind as the 2 ninja leaped down behind him. The ninja swung their chains, but Naruto ducked, pulling out his katana and swinging it toward one's legs. The ninja jumped over the blade and aimed a kick for his head, forcing Naruto to roll away quickly to avoid his foot. At the same time Sasuke tossed a kunai, catching one of the nin's chains against a tree, then leaped forward as the other abandoned Naruto and raced toward the horrified Sakura and Tajuna, who seemed frozen the moment Kakashi-sensei had been torn apart. Such a sensation was rushing through Naruto's veins, something he had never felt before, and likely would never understand. Everything seemed so vivid, clear minute little details were somehow apparent, such as the small scratches and chips along the enemy nin's mask, or how the light glinted off of his katana as he swung it at the man's head. This was also similar to training with Sasuke, dodging, striking, parrying, except the enemy had a very noble chain instead of the straight and sturdy katana. The nin managed to wrap the chain around his katana and yanked it from his hands, flinging it far from the battle. Naruto leaped back as the man swung the clawed chain, felt the pain as it pierced his hand, but he felt no fear. Had they taken it all away? Even now, he could feel them watching him, a low din of noise in the back of his mind. Out of the corner of his eye he could see that Kakashi-sensei had reappeared, knocking down the other nin that Sasuke had been fighting, and his roommate turned to him and tossed a kunai. The enemy nin dodged the kunai, swinging his chain at Naruto's head, but he twisted about, snatching the kunai out of the air as it passed and swinging it at the nin's throat as he finished the spin. He felt the kunai cut into the man's throat, passing through the fabric that covered his neck, and slicing into the flesh. The man gave a choking gurgle, eyes wide in surprise as blood squirted from his jugular all over Naruto's face. The ninja dropped to the ground, grabbing his throat, twitching several times before becoming still, but Naruto's focus was on something else, or more like nothing at all, as ecstasy ran through him, and once again all the colors seemed to blur together. He could feel the muscle loosen in his body, his headache vanished, and they murmured gently through his head, their pleasure his, and for once, they did not laugh at him, or hurt him. They were completely satisfied. Son of a bitch, the enemy ninja tried to surge to his feet as the other fell to the ground, his blood spurting all over the dirt, but Kakashi-sensei punched the man in the stomach roughly, and he slumped to the ground, momentarily unconscious. Behind him, he could hear Sakura's ragged breaths, and he briefly wondered what she was getting all worked up about. It wasn't like she had contributed to the fight. No, Sasuke had to abandon Naruto to go to her rescue because he truly doubted she knew anything beyond kunai tossing, and the very basics of taijutsu hair pulling didn't count. And there was a moment of his own to be ashamed of, for when the enemy nins had first attacked, he hadn't been able to move, he had been frozen by the sight of Kakashi-sensei's body being torn apart. Apparently, Naruto didn't have that problem, and had burst into action the moment those two nin had approached him. It had taken Sasuke several precious seconds to get his bearings and come to his companion's aid. It was shameful, very shameful, and he was grateful his father wasn't here to witness his momentary weakness. Sasuke rushed over to Naruto, who was standing near the body, and he was sure his roommate was probably in shock, having killed someone for the first time, and he almost felt envious of him, having passed that hurdle. He stopped at his side, eyeing the dead ninja. His eyes were still open, looked over at Naruto, and felt an instant chill run through him. There was blood on his companion's face, which wasn't anything new beyond the fact that for once it wasn't his own, but it was his expression that chilled him. Naruto was staring off into the trees, eyes lazy, looking quite sated, and his lips were turned up in a happy smile. It was the second time in 2 hours he had seen that smile, and it disturbed him, especially at this moment, for though it was a pleasant smile, the look in Naruto's lazy eyes was not particularly friendly, as it was bloodthirsty, murderous, or maliciously delighted. Hey, he nudged Naruto's shoulder as Kakashi-sensei approached, and Sasuke knew he didn't want the man to see Naruto like this. Hey! Snap out of it! He hissed in his ear, and pinched his arm, which caused the look of happiness to fade immediately, and Naruto to turn accusing eyes on him. That was more like it. Kakashi-sensei knelt down by the dead ninja and turned his body so that he could see the killing wound, and the hitayate strapped to his shoulder. Shinobi from the mist, he muttered, eye serious as he glanced up at Naruto, who was staring edgily at Tajuna, who had approached along with Sakura and was much too close to him. Naruto promptly moved to his other side, so that Sasuke was between him and Tajuna. Kakashi-sensei turned his eye from Naruto and frowned at the old man as he straightened up. I was under the impression that this was a simple escort mission, with the possibility of bandits or gangs. but 2 missing nin from hidden mist? We have to have a talk, Tajuna-san. This C rank mission just moved up to at least B rank. As the old man averted his eyes guiltily, Sakura sputtered, B rank. We can't do that. We're not qualified. We dash. Sasuke turned a cold gaze on her, effectively shutting her up, and Kakashi-sensei turned to Naruto. Naruto, you've got a cut on your hand that we're going to have to take care of. Naruto, who had been staring at the dirt, lifted his hand, and Sasuke could see angry slashes across the back of his right hand. Sakura gave a slight hiss at the sight of it, but Naruto seemed to lose interest after it was brought to his attention, and his hand flopped back down, a trickle of blood falling from it and into the dirt. Kakashi-sensei shook his head. It may look like nothing, but the claws of these 2 men are poisonous. We have to induce bleeding to drain out the poison. Sasuke looked at Naruto in alarm as the Kakashi-sensei approached, which did not seem to please the blonde, who backed away, smoothing his hood down. With the bruising and the blood, he looked even worse now than before. Naruto moved away from them, pulling out a kunai and digging it into the wound, making them all grimace, though his facial expression was set on resigned. Kakashi-sensei sighed and handed Sasuke bandages from his first aid kit, and Sasuke headed over to the blonde, grabbing his wrist and examining the wound, which looked even worse now than before. He wrapped it up, glancing up at Naruto's face every once in a while, gauging his expression, which still seemed stuck on resigned and miserable. Good job, he muttered lowly, so that the others would not hear him, and Naruto's eyes fluttered in response. When Naruto's hand was all but mummified, they returned to the others. Kakashi-sensei was in the process of tying the surviving missing nin up, and Sakura had retrieved Naruto's blade, smartly handing it to him instead of the blonde. Thanks for coming to our rescue, Sakura blushed as he handed the blade over to Naruto. Sasuke scowled and looked back at her. I hope to not have to do that often. Sakura's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the dirt, much like Naruto was doing at the moment, and he noticed that Tajuna was frowning at him, but not with the usual force that he had earlier. The elderly man was looking quite grim. They moved along for another few hours, surrounding Tajuna and keeping sharp eyes out for another attack. Sakura seemed to have fallen into a dark mood, Kakashi-sensei was more pensive than usual, and Naruto seemed to be in the midst of one of his headaches again. Sasuke moved closer to the blonde, which wasn't much since Naruto was already walking close enough. Did you see him? He whispered, glancing at the others to make sure they hadn't heard as Naruto lifted watery, pain-filled eyes to him in question. The man you killed. Did you see his ghost? Naruto glanced behind them in alarm but shook his head. No ghost. Naruto shook his head again, rubbing above his brow in pain. Interesting. What made a person a ghost? Under what circumstances caused them to become that way? They came to a river not too much later, where a man waited uneasily for them on a poorly made dock, his weathered face tight with anxiety. They all boarded the boat quietly, the ferryman admonishing them to be as quiet as possible. Of course, it was then that Tajuna felt it appropriate to tell of why he had lied to them about the mission rank. The cause of the lie was unfortunate, and they all felt bad for the small island country, except maybe for Naruto, who spent the whole trip staring down into the water, eyes blurred with pain, and probably not having heard a word the bridge builder had said. He knew that the blonde often suffered from intense headaches, yet he hadn't thought it would be much of a problem on this mission. But if they got into any more battles with Naruto like this, or maybe the poison had affected him faster than they had surmised. He eyed Naruto's bandaged hand, and thought that maybe he should check it for unnatural swelling. Would the injured hand hinder him from doing jutsu properly? He wondered if Naruto was capable of doing any jutsu at all, especially after the Kyuubi's chakra running through his system so violently. They should have checked before they had departed. He nudged his roommate and leaned close to his hooded ear. Do you think you could perform any jutsu during this mission? At first it seemed like Naruto hadn't heard him, but then he nodded slowly as if trying to limit the movement of his head, his eyes shut tightly. Sasuke took his bandaged hand and unwrapped it carefully, Naruto giving no indication that he noticed. He eyed the wound, and Kakashi-sensei leaned back to peer at the hand, his eye narrowing at the sight. Sasuke moved the hand from his view, watching the Jounin's expression from the corner of his eye as he rewrapped Naruto's hand. The wound was already half healed, no doubt due to the fox, and he hadn't wanted Kakashi-sensei to see that. But it was too late, judging by the speculative look in the Jounin's eye. The boat moved silently along the river, passing through a tunnel and out into a rather nice shore, exposing the forest that rested along it. "Welcome to Wave," the bridge builder breathed, and there was sad adoration in his eyes, and even Naruto looked up to blink at his surroundings, his nose crinkling in distaste at the smell of seawater. Tajuna thanked the ferryman as they docked, and quickly headed along the dirt path, closer to their destination. While they had been on the boat, they had seen the large, almost finished bridge that Tajuna was risking all on, and Sasuke had to admit it was pretty impressive. They headed down a slightly forested path, on one side trees, the other the gray ocean, with its constant chatter from gulls and the rush of waves breaking against the shore. Naruto bumped into him again, and he looked to see that the blonde seemed barely lucid, and as he opened his mouth to hiss at him, he saw a flash of white in the bushes on Naruto's right. He tossed a kunai quickly, startling Sakura and Tajuna, and attracting Kakashi-sensei's attention. "Did you see something, Sasuke-kun?" Sakura asked nervously, pulling out her own kunai. Sasuke moved toward the bush, peering over it to spot a frightened white rabbit. "Ah," Sakura gushed, picking it up and running a hand through its thick fur. "It's just a rabbit. Wrong color, for weather." He turned to see Naruto squinting painfully at the rabbit, apparently having a hard time forming words, but he didn't miss the narrow-eyed look Kakashi-sensei was giving the rabbit and the surrounding area. There was a whooshing sound, and Kakashi-sensei shouting for them to duck, and he grabbed Tajuna and dropped to the dirt, feeling a gust of wind rush over them accompanied by a loud solid thunk. Beside him, Naruto was looking much more lucid now, and frightened too. Sasuke looked up from the dirt and spotted a rather large Zanbato embedded into a tree, and standing on it was a shirtless man in striped pants, and bandages wrapped around the lower half of his face. Kakashi-sensei was already on his feet, staring up at the ninja. "If it isn't Mamakai Zabuza, Hidden Mist's missing nin," he drawled as Sasuke got to his feet, the others following along. He pulled out his katana, but paused when Kakashi-sensei held up a hand. "No, stay out of this fight. He's too much for you. You're Sharingan Kakashi, yes? Sorry, but the old man is mine." The man's voice was a deep baritone, not that Sasuke cared much, especially as his words sank into his mind. "Sharingan." His eyes zeroed in on the back of his sensei's head. Kakashi-sensei had the Sharingan. Impossible, no one outside of the Uchiha clan had that technique. It was passed through the blood, and the only way he could have it was if he was a blood relative. Was he? "What's the Sharingan?" Sakura whispered, her voice trembling slightly. The man looked at her. "It's said that it gives one the ability to defeat any ninjutsu, taijutsu, or genjutsu, and the ability to copy any technique used against him. In the bingo book it's said that you've copied 1,000 techniques, a copy ninja Kakashi." The man looked delighted. Kakashi-sensei lifted the Hitaiate that sat over his left eye, and to Sasuke's shock, it revealed the bloody Sharingan, that was it clearly, with 3 pinwheels. "You guys stay back and guard Tajuna-san," he ordered, and this was the first time they had heard him sound so serious. Naruto moved reluctantly closer to Tajuna, pulling out his katana, face pained and grim. Sasuke reluctantly backed up in front of the old man as well, wishing he could just fight Mamakai Zabuza instead of standing by and watch. He also wanted to ask how the Jonin had come about possessing the Sharingan. The missing nin darted from the tree, pulling the Zanbato with him, and dropped down into the water, reappearing to stand on top of it. "Ninpo, Mizu no Jutsu," and immediately a mist rolled over them, engulfing the missing nin completely and converging upon them. "He's gone." Sakura gasped. "Calm down," was Kakashi-sensei's assuring reply. "He'll come after me first," but even as he said this, a wave of pure killing intent rushed through them, like none Sasuke ever felt before, and he was sure in the next few moments he would be dead. He was no match for this ninja, not he, not Naruto, and he managed to glance at his blonde companion, whose face was twisted in fear and resignation as the mist nin began to list ways to kill them. "Don't worry, Sasuke," Kakashi-sensei's voice cut through the terror, "I'll protect you guys even if it kills me," and the Jonin sent him a cheerful look. Even as he spoke, Zabuza's presence appeared behind them. Immediately Naruto jumped forward, out of the way, but it was Kakashi-sensei that saved the rest of them, shoving them forward while stabbing the missing nin in the stomach with a kunai. For a second the man froze, then burst into water, at the same time appearing behind the Jonin, swinging his Zanbeitu and cutting the Jonin in half. But he too burst into water, and Sasuke knew that Kakashi-sensei had copied the Mizu Bunshin technique that quickly. Kakashi appeared behind him, kunai to his neck. You copied my Bunshin, using it to distract me with those pathetic words while you hid out in my mist, watching me, the missing nin chuckled. Impressive. Suddenly a second Zabuza appeared behind Kakashi. But I'm not that easy. We have to help him. Sakura gasped, green eyes wide with fear, looking over at them. Sasuke agreed, they should help, but he knew they would only get in the way. Rage passed through him. He was still so weak. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Naruto rasped beside him, and he turned to see a Bunshin pop up next to Naruto. The blonde and the Bunshin stared at one another for a moment, then the clone nodded and headed for the shore, slipping into the water quietly under the ring of metal against metal. He sent the blonde a questioning look. He's a mist nin, Naruto rasped. He'll stay near the water. Sasuke nodded. Every so often, he forgot that Naruto was actually smart. Just as he finished thinking this, Kakashi-sensei was knocked into the water, and as he tried to surface, the mist nin popped up behind him, chuckling in delight. Suru no Jutsu, at his words a bubble of water formed around Kakashi-sensei, lifting him into the air a foot above the water. Kakashi-sensei tried hitting the watery bubble, but to no avail, and judging by the missing nin's cackle, it was useless. You shouldn't have fallen into the water, Kakashi. You'll never escape this prison, and while I have you, I think I'll finish off your little troop playing ninja. Fear came over their sensei's face as he shouted for them to leave. Get out of here. None of you are a match for him. Escape. As he shouted, a Bunshin formed itself from the water, stepping onto land. Get out of here. Kakashi shouted. He has to stay with me to keep me imprisoned, and his Bunshin can't go very far from him. So leave. Sweat appeared above Sasuke's brow as he looked at the Bunshin, to Zabuza, to Kakashi, to his teammates. Sakura was trembling, Tajuna's face was twisted in a grimace, and Naruto's weary eyes were on him, waiting for him to tell them what to do. Like hell he was going to run like a dog with his tail between his legs. He gripped his katana, and that seemed to affirm to Naruto that they indeed intended to stay and fight, whether it killed them or not. Guard Tajuna, he ordered to Sakura, who nodded sharply and stood in front of the man just as the Bunshin darted forward, kicking Naruto in the chest. The blonde managed to bring up the flat of his blade to take the blunt of the force, knocking him back a few feet, and Sasuke swung his blade at the Bunshin's head. The Bunshin dropped down, avoiding the swipe and coming up with a punch to his abdomen. Sasuke grunted, glared at the water Bunshin as Naruto approached with two other clones, and that's when he remembered the one that had disappeared into the water. Hey, he gestured his head toward the water, and Naruto turned his head and gazed momentarily at the ocean before he and his clones attacked the Bunshin. All were knocked away, though the Mizu Bunshin had to actually do some work, and as Naruto was pushed back, Sasuke gathered his chakra. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. As the fire engulfed the startled Bunshin, the Kage Bunshin that hid in the water chose that moment to leap out at Zabuza, kunai taking a swipe at the man's arm. The mist nin's eyes widened as he was forced to jerk out of the way, his arm that was buried in the bubble was pulled out, and with a splash, Kakashi-sensei was released. Damn brats! Zabuza snarled, turning to Kakashi-sensei, and immediately their hands began to form identical signs, and shouting, Suten, Suiari Udan no Jutsu. Sasuke watched in awe as twin dragons made of water rose behind the two ninja and violently crashed into one another with a loud crack. Sasuke's awe turned into alarm as a torrent of water rushed toward them, knocking him back. He rolled with the water, allowing himself to be moved until he grabbed onto a tree and pulled himself up. From where he was, he could not hear what they were saying, but every time the missing nin made a move, Kakashi-sensei copied it, until the Jonin appeared behind the mist nin and blasted him with a huge torrent of water, knocking them all back again. Sasuke grabbed onto the tree tightly, muscles straining against the angrier flow of water, until it settled, and he could look up again. The scene that greeted him was even more startling. Kakashi-sensei had Zabuza up against a tree, ready to land a killing blow, he imagined, when two senbon needles pierced through the missing nin's neck, killing him. The man dropped limply to the ground as Sasuke approached, and a young muffled voice called his attention to the tree, where a masked kid kneeled. "You are right, he is dead." The kid dropped down next to the dead missing nin, looking over the body. "I must thank you," the youthful voice said. "I've been waiting for a chance to kill this man." "You a hunter nin from Hidden Mist?" Kakashi-sensei asked, and the kid nodded. "Yes. Finally, my village can clean up this mess." He tossed the man over his small shoulders. "Thank you." He and the body disappeared in swirl of mist. "What just happened?" Sakura's voice broke the momentary silence, and Sasuke looked around to see the soaked Kunoichi approach with the bridge builder. That's when he remembered his blonde companion, and his eyes darted around for him, finally landing on him quite a distance away, simply standing there, hair plastered to his bruised face, looking waterlogged and miserable. He had two katana in his hands, and Sasuke realized he must have dropped his own when the first blast of water hit them. He gestured for his companion to approach. Really, he didn't know why Naruto was standing all the way over there in the first place, and the blonde reluctantly limped over to where they were. Wasn't that kid our age? How could he kill that man so easily? Sakura sputtered incredulously. Kakashi-sensei looked down at her. "In this world, there are kids younger than you that are stronger than me." Sakura gasped, and Sasuke's eyes narrowed. Yes, that was true. Itachi had made Umbu captain by 13, and he knew he would not be able to say the same for himself. Sasuke's fists clenched in silent fury, missing the empty look Naruto sent his way. "We should be getting Tajuna-san home now," Kakashi-sensei suggested as he pulled his hitayate down over the eye that carried the Sharingan. "Yes." Tajuna dropped his sun hat over his wet gray hair. "You can all come to my place and rail dash." They all watched as Kakashi-sensei dropped down flat into the mud. "Kakashi-sensei!" Sakura screeched, making Naruto jump and look at her in alarm as she rushed to her sensei's side, turning the groaning man over. "Are you hurt badly?" she asked, voice heavy with concern. Sasuke moved to kneel down and examine him, but there were no serious wounds on the jaw and beyond a simple cut on his arm. He gestured for Naruto to come over and have a look. Though he wasn't sure why, it wasn't like Naruto was a medic nin or anything, but Naruto knew a lot of seemingly random important facts. The blonde pulled his soaked hood over his wet locks, shaking from the cold, and blinked miserably down at their sensei's body. Then he spoke. "Does the Sharingan take chakra to work?" Sasuke's brows rose, and he nodded. "Must have used too much chakra then." His arms wrapped around his body and he turned and moved away slowly. "He'll recover, in a week or so." His voice drifted back to them as he moved along their intended path. "Is he kidding?" Sakura stared incredulously after the blonde, and Sasuke sighed. "Let's get him up." He gripped his sensei by the armpits and Sakura took his legs. "Your place better not be far," Sasuke sent Tajuna a glare, and the man simply grinned in reply. The home in which belonged to Tajuna was over water, on stilts, and the mere sight of it made Naruto pale in horror. Or perhaps it was the armless man pacing mournfully about the house, his stubs tracking blood along the wooden dock. He had tanned skin and dark hair, with dark eyes swollen with tears. He turned as they approached, and his eyes zeroed in on him, and Naruto looked down at the wooden dock. The first thing they did was get Kakashi-sensei into the house and down on a futon, where he muttered that he would be fine with a few days' rest. Tsunami, Tajuna's ill-named daughter, at least he thought so, especially living in a village that stretched along the coast, immediately sat them down to eat, which Sakura, Sasuke, and Tajuna seemed eager to do. He, on the other hand, felt like crawling out of his skin. There was sand in his sandals, salt settling along his flesh, and he was in someone's poorly cleaned house. The very table they sat before had salt stuck within the nooks of it. He needed cleanser badly. "Are you all right?" the dark-haired woman asked, and he did not bother looking up at her. "Is he all right?" Her question was directed toward the others. "He's fine," he heard Sasuke reply, and then she made an inquiry as to why he wasn't eating. He tuned out Sasuke's reply, instead focusing on more serious matters, besides the state of Tajuna's home. Naruto never wanted to be a ninja, never even had much interest in it in general, but Sasuke and the Hokage had forced him along that path, and he mostly blamed Sasuke for this. They had never shown interest in the world of shinobi until Sasuke had shown up, and since then, they had pushed him almost as much as Sasuke had. And it became increasingly clear that the longer he stayed on this path, the shorter his life was going to be, not that he expected it to be a long one anyway. Deep down, he was a little bit startled that he was still alive. The Demon Brothers were the first real ninja they had come across, and if it weren't for the intervention of them, he knew he would be dead already. He wasn't stupid, he could tell what they were doing. They wanted him to want to kill people, to fall into their bloodlust. All during the trip they kept coming and going from his eyes, making them hurt and hard to see. They wanted to control him as they have for all of his life, and they had chosen Sasuke as their tool. Perhaps Sasuke's father was right, perhaps Sasuke was wrapped around his finger, just not his finger. Sasuke nudged him, and he looked up to see that the table had been cleared, and the others were getting ready to rest for the night. Tsunami had apparently laid out 3 futons next to Kakashi-sensei's, and Sakura was already laying down next to the Jonin. Naruto slowly got to his feet and followed Sasuke towards the futons, but he paused when his eyes fell on the window, where the armless man stood looking in, eyes swollen with tears. They weren't safe. His eyes darted to all the windows, which were wide open, a clear ocean breeze running through, unhindered. Naruto's eyes widened, and his heart began to thunder in his ears. He shouldn't be here, this wasn't his place. This wasn't where he belonged. His place had covered windows, not opened ones, his place had protection, his place was clean, not contaminated. The man continued to stare at him, his mouth opening and a trickle of blood ran down his chin. Puffs of rust came from his mouth, someone was touching him, and Naruto's eyes darted wildly and connected with Sasuke's dark ones. Sasuke's face had that forced calm he adopted when he was dealing with him, and he gently pulled Naruto to the futon. The filthy futon. Naruto shook his head wildly and fled to a corner, the one farthest from the windows, and buried his face in his hands, pulling at his bangs, feeling a headache bloom. Hours later, someone nudged him, and he moved his hands from his face to see Sasuke crouching before him in the darkness. Behind him, Sakura and Kakashi-sensei slumbered, clearly unaware of the danger they were all in. His eyes darted to the open windows and he bit his tongue sharply as to not make noise. "Here," Sasuke whispered, and something poked his hand. He looked down to see that it was one of his candy bars, completely normal, and with Sasuke's body shielding him from view, he quickly ate the bar, relieved that no one would see him eat it. When that was done, Sasuke brought over his pack and he pulled out the disinfectant wipes he had stashed at the bottom and wiped as much of himself as he could, and Sasuke did the same. "Is there someone out there?" he asked suddenly, and Naruto's eyes darted to the man at the window. He was still there, still watching him. Naruto shuddered and nodded. Sasuke turned and looked at the window before getting up and closing the shutters, then pulled the curtains together. He cautiously closed and curtained all the windows so that the moonlight was shut out, and finally, Naruto felt a little ease run through him. Sasuke returned and sat down in front of him, brows pinched together as he frowned down at his pants. "Kakashi-sensei's last name is Hatake, right?" Naruto nodded. "So how come he has the Sharingan?" Anger was laced in his question, along with confusion and jealousy. "Only the Uchiha possess this bloodline." Naruto scratched his scalp then cringed when he felt salt under his fingers. He felt disgusting. He blinked at the Uchiha miserably, knowing that this was all his fault, and also that Sasuke was apparently not the most observant person around. "There was a scar on the lids of his eye," Naruto replied, and the Uchiha looked surprised. "It means that his eye has been replaced." Understanding dawned on Sasuke. "You think he lost his eye and an Uchiha gave one to him?" Before he could reply, Sasuke scowled. What idiot Uchiha would do that? That bloodline is exclusive. He would have gotten in much trouble with the heads of my clan if that was found out. He'd have to have already been Sasuke cut himself off, instead staring down at the filthy floor. Naruto went back to wiping himself, and even began to run the wipes through his hair in an attempt to get the salt out. He silently cursed Sasuke while he did so. The next day Kakashi-sensei woke to a grim revelation, and he had them gather around to hear it. Zabuza had escaped death, with help from the hunter nin who could be either real or fake, though it didn't matter which. It appeared they had less than a week to train and get their bodies in high gear. Sasuke couldn't help but tremble in excitement. He wanted another chance to fight, to prove that he wasn't just some kid playing ninja. Beside him, Sakura looked alarmed and uneasy, and on his other side, Naruto was, staring at the floor, eyes running along the cracks and no doubt lamenting on how dirty the place was. "What will we doing for training?" Sakura asked. "I have something planned," Kakashi replied with a gleam in his eye. "Sounds boring," a small voice said behind them, and he turned to see a small dark-haired boy in a hat stare back at them with dark miserable eyes, though he imagined no one could do miserable like Naruto. "Oh. Hello," Sakura greeted with a puzzled smile, and Tazuna introduced him as Inari, his grandson. The kid clung to his mother, then said, "They're all going to die." Sakura frowned as Tazuna sighed. "Inari. What's the point? No one can defeat Gato, they're just wasting their time." He then turned and went back to wherever the hell he had come from, which was perfectly okay with Sasuke, who didn't want to stay around the little bastard anyway. He glanced to see what Naruto thought of this, but forced down an exasperated sigh when he saw that Naruto hadn't even turned around to see who had addressed them. He was still staring at the ground with the same aggrieved expression on his face. Yes, no one could do miserable like Naruto. The next day they stood in the trees, waiting for Kakashi-sensei to arrive, as they usually did, except this time he would have a valid excuse for his lateness. In the meantime, he and Sasuke occupied themselves with their usual warm-up of taijutsu while Sakura did stretches and watched them with silent speculative eyes. He didn't like when she watched them. There was a rustle of leaves, and they turned to see Kakashi-sensei arrive, one arm occupied with a crutch, but otherwise he seemed okay. "Alright, so this is where we're going to do some training. But first, I want one of you to tell me what chakra is." Sakura stepped forward. "Chakra is the energy a ninja needs when performing a jutsu." "That's correct, Sakura," Kakashi nodded. "Can anyone elaborate more?" Sasuke nudged him, and Naruto grimaced. "Chakra energy has two parts, the body energy that is in each our cells, and spiritual energy gained through training and other experiences. Combining them creates chakra, and by releasing such, one can use a jutsu, which is achieved through the process of performing a seal with the hands. Common seals used are the rat seal, ox seal, tiger seal, hare seal, dragon seal, serpent seal, horse seal, ram seal, monkey seal, bird seal, dog seal, and the boar seal. Doing these correctly dash." "Okay Naruto," Sasuke interrupted, and he glanced up to see that the others were staring at him. "Right." Kakashi-sensei stared at him more for a second, then smiled. "Ah, Umino-san had some smart students. Now, the most important thing about chakra is that, no matter how much you have, if you don't have proper control over it, any jutsu you create will be weak, or not work at all." Sasuke's brows rose at this. "And by wasting so much energy, you won't last very long in a battle. Not to mention, there may or most likely will be a time when you'll be fighting and gathering chakra at the same time, which is difficult. So today, we're going to learn better chakra control." "How?" Sakura asked eagerly. "Tree climbing." "What? What kind of training is that?" "Well, first off, you won't be climbing with your hands." He walked over to a tree, then walked vertically up it, without use of his hand. Sakura gasped in awe as Kakashi-sensei hung upside down from a branch. "You'll have to direct chakra to your feet to stick to the tree." "How will this help you, you ask?" "Well, by concentrating a small amount to the bottom of your feet, you learn better chakra control. Learn how to do this properly, and you can do just about any jutsu." Theoretically, Naruto thought. Some jutsu were simply beyond regular means, beyond simple control. The Jonin walked back down the tree and whipped out his book. "Go ahead and pick a tree. Mark each spot you reach and beat that." Sasuke and Sakura eagerly pulled out a kunai and ran for a tree. Naruto sighed and walked up to one, concentrating chakra to his feet, took a few steps up before stumbling back down. Next to him, Sasuke dropped down from a considerable height, looking peeved and pleased at the same time. That is, until Sakura exclaimed how easy that was, and they both looked up to see her sitting comfortably in her tree, which was no surprise to him, but was apparently for Sasuke. Well, Kakashi-sensei hummed. That's quite impressive, Sakura. Maybe you should be the #1 rookie, Sasuke glared and ran for the tree, while Sakura yelled at the Jonin to be quiet. As Naruto approached the tree again, they surfaced again from the simple murmur at the back of his mind to right behind his eyes, and he stiffened, feeling his eyes turn to the right, where to his surprise, he spotted the little child Inari behind a tree, watching them. Behind Inari was the armless man, and when their eyes connected, man made a puffy gasp and fled, disappearing soundlessly into the forest. Come on, Naruto, Sasuke urged as he dropped down to the ground again. You're not even trying. Let's go. Naruto sighed miserably and headed up the tree again, they retreating back to murmurs. Hours later, they were at the bottom of the trees, sweaty, tired, and he was sure Sasuke and Sakura were hungry. Sasuke had a perpetual scowl on his face, repeatedly glancing up at his marks, unsatisfied, and of course, when he looked at Naruto's, which were apparently even less satisfactory, seemed to put him in an even more sour mood. I can't believe you guys are still going at it, Sakura panted from her tree, which had all the highest marks. She got up and dusted herself off, looked nervously between the two, then bit her lip as she approached him. Naruto smoothed down his hood and turned to move toward Sasuke. Hey Naruto, she reached out to grab his shoulder, but seemed to think better of it and instead brushed her hair out of her face. Naruto looked at her. What did she want? I was just going to say that you should just relax, and focus, on the tree. Yeah. Her eyes darted from his end to the ground, then back again, before she turned completely red. Yeah, well, I'm going to go get something to eat, I mean. She stammered her way away from him, and he watched her go. Sasuke got up and came to his side. What did she want? Naruto turned to him. She said to relax and focus on the tree. Sasuke nodded and headed back to the tree. Naruto went to his and tried to relax, but he could not quiet his mind. His mind was never quiet. He couldn't even understand the concept of relaxation and quiet. Instead he focused as little chakra as he could and headed up the tree, actually getting farther than his previous attempts before his chakra stuttered to a halt, and he leaped up and grabbed a branch, swinging himself up and sitting down. His body ached. Sasuke moved into his tree and handed him a candy bar, and he glanced around for witnesses before he quickly ate it. Sasuke grimaced, then wiped the sweat from his brow. Why do you think Sakura could do it so quickly? He asked, sounding agitated. Naruto folded the wrapper and neatly placed it in his pocket, so he could dispose of it later. Because she's female. What does that have to do with anything? Naruto sighed, feeling a headache bloom. Kunoichi naturally have less chakra than men, so they have better control, which is why most genjutsu masters are women. It is also why some of the best medic nins are women. Of course, there are exceptions to this rule, as there is to everything. We have more chakra than Sakura, therefore, more to control. Where'd you learn that? Handbook, Everything Ninja. Sasuke blinked at him, then jumped down from the tree. Come on, we have a lot to do, he called up at him, and they murmured their agreement. While Sakura and Kakashi spent the coming days protecting Tajuna as he built the bridge, he and Sasuke continued to climb the tree, until he never wanted to see another tree again. That night, as the others sat at the table and ate, and Tsunami silently fretted over why he wasn't eating, Sakura commented on a picture that had a person torn out of it. He thought it was stupid of her to bring up because he'd seen it days ago, and it was clearly none of their business as to why the person had been removed from the portrait, and judging by Sasuke's glare, he felt the same way. But apparently Sakura lacked tact along with common sense, and they were gifted with the story of Inari's father Kaiza, who upon hearing his name, decided to look in the open windows, making his head ache even worse. Why hadn't Tsunami kept the windows drawn and closed? Was she punishing him for not eating her food? Please, Kaiza whimpered, puffs of gray smoke coming from his mouth, and they became louder. Naruto dropped his head in his hands as Tajuna finished his story, unaware of Kakashi's eye on him, watching as he dug his nails into his scalp. Sakura was awakened, though she didn't know by what, and she lifted her head from her futon, blinking into the darkness, noticing that the windows were shut and curtains drawn. A sound came, a word, and she turned her head in Sasuke's direction, and spotted Naruto sitting near him, rocking back and forth, his hood drawn low over his face. Indecipherable words drifted from his bruised mouth, and she slowly sat up. Uzumaki scared her. His uncaring, accusing eyes disturbed her. Sasuke-kun had come to her rescue several times already on this mission, but it was like merely acknowledging her existence was painful for the blonde. She'd watched him closely after he had killed that ninja, the demon brother, had wanted to see him shaken, horrified, but she couldn't tell when he always looked so miserable. She knew Ino was right, though Naruto wouldn't shed a single tear if something were to happen to her, and she couldn't help feel the surge of resentment that ran through her. And who did Sasuke-kun spend all his energy on? Naruto stopped rocking, instead looking up at the windows, and even in the dark, she could see the whites of his eyes. She lifted her leg, about to go and ask him if he was alright, when Sasuke lifted his head, blinking blearily at her, then looked behind himself at Naruto. He lifted his hand and rested it on the blonde, making him jump, but Naruto seemed to relax, pulling out a small book and leafing through it. Sasuke returned his hand and settled back to sleep. Sakura lay back down, eyeing the reading blonde carefully before shutting her eyes. She didn't notice the minimal light gleaming against Kakashi's eye as he watched. The sun had yet to rise, and Naruto's headache was worse than ever, so much that he staggered from the house and across the dock, moving into the trees where he could whimper and howl in pain without anyone hearing him, not over the sound of the crashing surf. They were a cacophony in his head, angry, eager, impatient, all these things at once, so that it felt like his eyes were going to pop from the pressure, and he clawed at his ears as he slumped down into a meadow-like clearing. He sobbed, wishing he were in the safety of his room, where the windows were covered, where no one would come and bother him. He couldn't stand being out here, being around people, being unclean. "You're bleeding," a soft voice commented, and he jumped, looking up to see a dark-haired girl crouched near him. Naruto shakily got to his feet, his brain making the world slosh around, until he tripped over his own feet. "Don't be afraid," the girl soothed, and placed a hand on his shoulder. Naruto jerked from it, instead slumping into the tree, rasping for breath and struggling to focus on her. The girl's eyes ran over his face and frowned, concern marring her brow. "Did you do that to your face?" Her eyes fell on his hitai that he had tied to his bicep. "Are you a ninja?" Naruto wiped his face, smearing the blood, and suddenly something caught his eye. Her calloused hands, something that wasn't really important, except that where the calluses were happened to be similar to all the ones he had, from hold kunai. He blinked rapidly to clear away the tears and took in her face, the long dark hair, and most especially, the array of healing herbs she had in her basket. "Are you the fake hunter nin?" he rasped, and watched the gentleness in her face strip away, and both their bodies stiffened. Her dark eyes stared into his pained ones, and a wry smile grew. "You have sad eyes," she commented, and her body loosened. "I've seen those eyes before, many times." She stood up and walked away. "I suppose we'll see each other again, on the battlefield." Sasuke appeared from the foliage, a frown on his face when she passed, but alarm grew when he spotted him, and he quickly rushed over, kneeling down to examine Naruto's face. "The headache?" he asked tersely, and Naruto managed a nod as the world seemed to dim to red. "Hunnin." He slurred, and felt Sasuke lift him bodily from the ground, and he thought no more. Inari had pissed him off enough that he had snarled quite nastily at the little bastard, sick of his constant lamenting over his dead father. They didn't hear his mother bitching about it, but the little moron seemed to want to spread his misery about like a disease. The last thing he needed was the punk to wake Naruto, who had uncharacteristically fallen asleep, and stayed that way past breakfast. This was unusual, because he knew Naruto slept very little, and also because it was a day in which Kakashi-sensei felt they might encounter Zabuza. They left Naruto behind and followed Tajuna to the bridge, and though they expected something to happen, they were still stunned when they were greeted by the bloody bodies of the employees. "What the hell?" Tajuna cried, rushing over to one of the guys, who was rasping for air. "What happened?" "A monster," the man gasped. Immediately a mist rolled in, and they quickly surrounded Tajuna. Sasuke felt a thrill of anticipation rush through him, much more exciting than when he and Naruto managed to successfully stick to the tree. "Ah, he's shaking," Zabuza's voice drifted mockingly from the mist just as they were surrounded by 10 to 15 Zabuza bunshin. "Go for it," Kakashi-sensei urged with a smile, and Sasuke grinned as he whipped out his kunai and surged forward, dispatching the Mizu Bunshin quickly, before they could even move. They splashed to the ground as the mist cleared, revealing Zabuza and his fake hunter nin. "Looks like the brat got a little tougher," the missing nin commented to the younger one. "Looks like you got a rival, Haku." "I suppose it does," the masked youth replied, and Sasuke felt another thrill of excitement. He badly wanted to fight this Haku person. "I'll take the masked fake." Sasuke took a step forward. Zabuza nodded to Haku, and the youth disappeared, only to reappear before him, and Sasuke barely got his kunai up in time to deflect the senbon. Haku made another move, swing the needle again, but he deflected it as well. "Don't underestimate me," Sasuke hissed. "I'd like not to kill you, but that's not going to stop you, is it?" "Don't be an idiot," Sasuke sneered, and the masked youth brought his hand up, a clear sign that he was gather chakra. With one hand, the masked youth began making seals, quickly, while the other pushed against his kunai. The water about them rose, surrounding them, then took the shape of needles. "I've got you," he said, and Sasuke concentrated chakra to his feet and legs, leaping up out of the way as the water needles flew towards him. They crashed together with the sound of breaking glass, which he ignored as he tossed shuriken down at the enemy, who leaped back out of the way. Sasuke appeared behind him. "You're pretty slow," he commented, and swung his katana, forcing the masked youth to block with his senbon, then jumped back as the needles broke under the force of the blade. Then he threw a kunai to finish the move, forcing the other to drop to the ground, leaving him vulnerable to Sasuke's kick, which knocked him back several feet. The masked nin got to his feet, having landed near Zabuza. "Haku, at this rate, we'll be driven back." "We can't have that," the mist nin looked peeved. "No," Haku replied, and the air suddenly seemed colder to Sasuke. "No, we can't." Water rose around Sasuke, and to his surprise, solidified into ice, clear sheets of frozen water, and Haku stepped forward and walked into the ice, his image appearing on every sheet. "Well now," the Haku images said, lifted a senbon needle, and before Sasuke could move, he was attacked on all sides by needles. He cried out, bringing his arms up to shield his neck and head from fatal hits, and he vaguely heard Sakura calling his name as his body burned up from the cold pain of the needles. He was in trouble. Naruto woke with a relieved start free from the colorful eyes that watched him in the black void. They had said nothing to him, but they had watched for what seemed like eternity, enough to drive him insane, and it was a relief to be away from those eyes. He quickly sat up, realizing immediately that he was alone, and that Sasuke was nowhere in sight. He quickly got to his feet, dizziness rushing through him before the world became stable, and he dug into his pack in search of something fresh to wear. To his chagrin, the only clean thing he found was the black hoodie that Kaori had given to him, and he reluctantly pulled off his sweater. "What happened to you?" a small voice asked. He jumped, and looked around, seeing that he was no longer alone, and that Inari's large dark eyes were staring at him. "Where'd you get all those bruises?" Naruto quickly pulled on the black sweater, grabbed his katana and strapped on several kunai. "They're going to die, you know. All of them." Naruto paused in the doorway, confronted by the man Kaiza, who was no longer weeping, and had a rather determined look on his face. He dropped down to his knees and looked up at Naruto beseechingly. "Please," his voice was stronger now, but no less pleading. "Please tell them to go to a safe place. Please, it's not safe here." Naruto glanced back at the boy, who was now accompanied by Tsunami, who gave him a concerned look, probably wondering why he was standing in the doorway. "Why, you should probably hide out somewhere safe for now. You might be targeted." The woman sent him a surprised look, then nodded. "We'll stay with a friend," she said, and Naruto moved from the doorway and walked down the dock. Inari was most likely right, they all were going to die, and it would be best if he joined them, because it wouldn't go well if he returned to Konoha alone. He made his way up to the bridge, and immediately the sound of metal assaulted his ears, and he sighed as the bridge came into view. He spotted Kakashi-sensei and Mamakai Zabuza fighting to one side, and nearby was a square box-like structure, made of what appeared to be ice. As he walked closer, he spotted Sakura nearing the ice structure, and she tossed a kunai at it. Naruto watched as the hunter nin appeared in the reflection of the ice, snatched the kunai from the air, and tossed it back at her. She shoved Tajuna out of the way and dodged it. Naruto turned his attention to the ice structure, moving close enough to feel the chill, and to see Sasuke in the middle of it, rising slowly to his feet, bleeding from many superficial cuts. Naruto took a few steps back from the ice prison and gathered his chakra. Katon, Gokakyu no Jutsu. He blew a billow of fire at the ice structure, catching the hunter Nin attention, forcing him to leap back as the Nin threw several shuriken at him. The fire hissed against the ice mirrors, but when the smoke cleared, there was no effect. Naruto glanced at his sensei, who seemed torn between fighting Zabuza and wanting to leap to Sasuke's aid. Naruto eyed the structure again before concluding that the jutsu must be cancelled by the user, and he reluctantly jumped over the ice walls and landed at Sasuke's side. Sasuke shook his head. "You probably shouldn't have done that." Naruto shrugged and peered at all the images. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, and several Bunshin appeared, each one attacking a mirror, but before they could land a hit, the masked Nin leaped from the mirror, a mere blur, and dispatched very one of them before returning to the mirror. "So you came," he commented from the mirror. "I wondered where you were. It was a nice try with the fire, but you're going to need a higher level than that to melt these mirrors." The air became filled with senbon, and Naruto lifted his arms to protect his head as he felt the needles sink into his flesh. The attack stopped, and he looked to see Sasuke was also stuck with pins, and he grunted as he removed some of them. "Tell me," the masked Nin seemed to direct his question to Naruto. "What do you fight for?" Naruto removed a needle from his right arm, and was alarmed when he could not feel any pain, nor move it. He grimaced a damaged nerve no doubt. He looked up at the Nin, feeling another headache bloom. "Nothing," he replied, and there was a minute jerk in the Nin's body. Had his reply surprised him? Did he expect more? "Shit," Sasuke muttered, and Naruto turned to see that Sasuke was staring down at a senbon needle that had pierced his knee, while his other leg trembled under the weight. "Can't move it," he grunted. Naruto lifted his head, and he imagined that the masked Nin and his eyes connected for a moment, a clear understanding of each one's intentions. And things happened rather quickly. Sasuke silently cursed his leg, grabbing the needle that was embedded in his leg with a slippery, bloody hand and tried to pull it out, biting his lip from the pain. At this rate, they were going to lose, and he couldn't stand the mere idea that he would lose to that masked bastard. There was a familiar gust of wind in front of him, smelling of detergent and bleach, and his head jerked up in surprise, immediately spotting Haku lying on the ground. Struggling to return to his feet, and he pulled out a kunai quickly to toss it at the Nin, but then he noticed Naruto, who was still standing in front of him, and his eyes traveled up his body, falling on several of the needles, before settling on the ones embedded in his neck. He dropped the kunai, his hands going numb. Naruto made a gurgling sound, and his legs crumbled under him. Sasuke managed to catch him, grunting at the weight but lowering him gently to the ground, eyes wide, mind going blank. Naruto's eyes were wide, blood trickling from his nose and mouth, whole body racked with small spasms. His wide, frightened blue eyes landed on him, his mouth opening and choked words drifted out. "Mad. They mad, so mad." The capillaries in his right eye popped, the eye swimming in blood. "What did you do?" Sasuke wheezed, his whole body feeling numb. "Just moved, couldn't help." And suddenly the trembling stopped and the pain seemed to fade from Naruto's face, leaving him looking momentarily surprised. So quiet, his voice was more clear now, and his gaze moved to the sky, blood leaking from one eye like tears. So quiet. And to Sasuke's silent horror, he stopped moving, stopped breathing, body going limp, empty eyes trained on the sky. Sasuke blinked several times, his mind having a hard time understanding what had happened. Naruto was dead? He landed a blow on me, and didn't even flinch. Haku's voice intruded upon his numbness. "Was he precious to you?" Naruto was dead. Naruto had jumped in front of him. Naruto had protected him. He had never asked Naruto to do that for him. Is this the first time a friend has died? "Shut up," Sasuke hissed, feeling the rage break through the numbness. "Shut the fuck up." He stood up, no longer feeling the pain in his body, could only feel hatred toward the one standing across from him. "I'm going to kill you." He raced toward the masked Nin, all his rage focused on crushing him, and when he moved, Sasuke could see it, almost predict it, and he dodged out of the way, grabbed the nin and smashed his fist into the masked face with enough force to crack through the mask. The nin staggered back, raised his hands to do a jutsu, but Sasuke was faster, and with a brutal chakra-induced kick, knocked the masked nin through the mirrors, oblivious to it shattering around him as he leaped upon the nin, raising his kunai to drive it into the gorilla face that looked calmly back at him. "Did he live for you?" he asked, and for a second Sasuke hesitated. Living was painful for him, he wanted to die. "I did him a favor, and he let himself go." Sasuke's lip curled up in hate. "Fuck you," he spat as he brought the kunai down, burying it into the boy's eye, uncaring that he hadn't tried to stop him. There was a great surge of chakra behind him, but he only turned and staggered back to where Naruto lay, staring up at the sky. He'd seen that same empty look on his mother's face when he had walked in on them, had seen it on several of his family members. His whole family, gone, Naruto gone, Kairi gone, everyone he knew, dying around him. Someone was saying his name, but he didn't care. It wasn't important, he felt drained, hollowed out. How long would Naruto have lived if Sasuke had never met him? He'd be back in his apartment, with his books and candy bars, and his pillow, cleaning every day without fail. Someone was shaking him, and a muffle of words seemed to make it to his brain. "Alive, Sasuke. He's alive." "What?" He looked up to see a very concerned sensei kneeling over Naruto, one arm on Sasuke's shoulder. Sasuke looked at Naruto, and the bloody blonde was shaking, trembling, face pained. Sakura was standing next to them, along with Tajuna, both their faces pale. "What happened?" Sasuke asked, looking around, and Sakura gave a weak smile. You defeated Haku." She glanced nervously back at the dead nin's body. "Your eyes were red." Naruto moaned, lifting an arm to touch his neck, his face the epitome of misery, and Sasuke felt pure relief run through him. Naruto was alive. Then he scowled. "Idiot," he muttered. Kakashi sat in Tajuna's home, staring down at the pale body displayed before him. Sasuke and Sakura were with Tajuna as he joyfully finished building the bridge, with many eager villagers helping him. Halfway through his fight with Zabuza, Gato and several of his lackeys had showed up, severing the contract he had made with the missing nin, and completely diverting his attention from the fight. Zabuza had instead attacked the Mogul, killing several of his men and removing Gato's head from his body, dying shortly after from blood loss. He'd then rushed to his student's side, expecting to finish off the youth, but found him with a kunai in the eye and Sakura trying to get Sasuke to speak. Said boy had been sitting in front of Naruto, eyes hollowed out and haunted, and when he had seen the state Naruto was in, he hadn't blamed him, and was all too glad to tell him that Naruto wasn't dead. He'd gotten them all back to Tajuna's place only to find that it had been ransacked by 2 samurai, Tsunami reported, having watched it happen from a neighbor's window where she and Inari had been hiding, via the suggestion from Naruto. After that, he had stripped the blonde so he could remove the needles from his neck and body, and now had time to mull over the overall condition of Naruto's body. As he had imagined, the bruising on his face wasn't exclusive to that area, in fact covering all of Naruto's body, though it was much faded and most likely looked worse days before. Kakashi could count every rib, and map the veins running along his arms. How had he managed to function all this time? He had been pondering the state of Naruto's mind for the last few days, and was going to request a psychiatric evaluation once they reached Konoha, because he had seen behavior that needed some serious professional help, the kind he wasn't qualified for. He looked up as Sasuke limped into the room and began to systemically shut every window and curtain before coming to the blonde's side. His nose stopped bleeding. Kakashi nodded, eye-watching as the Uchiha covered Naruto with a blanket and sat down next to him. For some reason, Naruto's nose wouldn't stop bleeding, enough to make him wonder if there was some hemorrhaging in the brain, a thoroughly alarming prospect, but the trickle had finally stopped an hour ago. "You can leave now," he raised a brow at the boy. "Naruto won't like it, it'll make him crazy, you being right here." "Define crazy." Sasuke scowled at him and rested his elbows against his crossed knees, intertwining his hands together and placing his chin on the back of his hands, dark eyes staring down at the blonde. Kakashi got to his feet and headed for the door, pausing to look back at the boys. "He'll be up and about in a week." and as he turned to go, Sasuke's soft reply gave him serious pause, because he knew Sasuke wasn't talking to him. Most likely sooner. You'll make it sooner, won't you? Chapter 12. Sasuke spent the next 2 days watching over Naruto, removing the gauze over the holes in his flesh, wiping him down, and getting him to eat. Naruto seemed content to stare at the ceiling and ignore the world around him, seeming more depressed than Sasuke was used to seeing him. Around them, Tsunami cleaned up. Tajuna practically skipped to work, having gotten most of the men in Wave to happily return to building the bridge. Inari moped. By the third day, Naruto sat up and took a hasty shower. To Sasuke's relief, he had thought he would have to threaten the blonde to get him moving, but something had gotten the other up and moving, suspiciously after his body had given a rather nasty jerk. Tsunami seemed to have finally breached the wall that separated her from Naruto, after he recovered enough to move about. Having spotted her in the process of cleaning up the mess that his men had created, Naruto took up cleaning the house with a fanaticism that Sasuke was familiar with. Tsunami had originally been delighted with his help, directing him to areas she needed help with, but that soon turned into concerned alarm when she realized that it wasn't a gesture of kindness that motivated him to clean. He scrubbed her walls, tables, floors, bedroom, whatever was washable was taken, and while the others watched on in disbelief, Sasuke sat by, counted his kunai, and waited it out. This was normal, this was Naruto, alive and as close to well as he would ever get, and Sasuke wasn't in the mood to complain. Every so often he would feel the chill, remember that brief moment of numbing horror, see Naruto lying there, bruised eyes gazing lifelessly at the sky, and he would look at the blonde, just to assure himself that the other was still alive. Never again would he allow such an event to take place. He also had other concerns, in the shape of a silver-haired Jonin. For days, he had watched the man watch Naruto with a dark calculating eye. He knew that Naruto was aware of the man watching him, judging by his increasingly hunched shoulders, and the fact that at intervals he would seek out Sasuke's company, standing by him. This would last only as long as it took Naruto's eyes to rove about the house and pick out imperfections, and he would then abandon Sasuke to fix them. In the end, his cleaning left Tsunami uncomfortable and nervous. It was halfway through the week that Naruto bothered to mention something else that was bugging him, in the form of Kaiza, who had apparently been wandering around the windows and doorway, looking in. His presence was upsetting Naruto, who kept as far from the windows as he dared. "What do you think he wants?" Sasuke asked, and Naruto threw a weary look in Inari's direction, who was moping, still. "You think he's hanging around because of that whiny little bastard?" Naruto shrugged, wringing his fingers in silent distress. By the week's end, they were ready to depart, and Tsunami's home looked better than before they had even arrived. The bridge had been officially completed, everyone was giddy to the point where it was ridiculous, and Sasuke was doubly grateful when they said their goodbyes and headed home. But no one could be more grateful than Naruto was. It practically showed on his face, sheer relief to be leaving the waterfront, to get the salt out of his skin, and to get newspaper between him and the rest of the world. The familiar bustle of Konoha was unexpectedly welcome to him as they moved into the village. Naruto lowered his hood down and stepped closer to Sasuke, anxious to return to the Uchiha compound, where it was safer. He had been sure, at one point, that he would perish in Wave, and he had been so close. Even now, he could remember the quiet, how peaceful it was in that brief moment, where they couldn't shout, coax, laugh, or hurt him. They were simply gone. He remembered Sasuke's face, pale with horror, eyes so wide. He remembered how angry they were, the rage pounding into him. He didn't know why he had jumped in front of Sasuke like that. Was it the ingrained instinct of a ninja? "Let's head to the tower and give our report," Kakashi-sensei suggested. "Remember, a mission isn't completely finished until you report it." "Okay," Sakura smiled as they headed toward the tower. They were greeted by the Hokage, and a report was given. Naruto didn't pay much attention to what was happening around him or what they were saying. His head was pounding and he feared to sleep. They were still seething, angry whispers echoing in the reaches of his mind. "Good job," the words cut through to him, and he looked up to see the Hokage's dark eyes pinned on him. He quickly averted his eyes and followed the others out of the tower, Kakashi-sensei stopping at the door. "You guys go ahead and take the rest of the day off, and tomorrow, to rest." Relief. Finally they were headed back to the compound. He lowered his hood as they parted ways with Sakura, walking closer to Sasuke, avoiding eye contact with any of the villagers. "We'll train," Sasuke said suddenly, glancing back at him. "Tomorrow. Tonight we rest." Sasuke made them stop at a market to buy more soup and candy bars, which upset him, because now he was seen with him purchasing the goods. What if they poisoned them? It was as he was agonizing over the possibilities of his poisoning that he spotted Nabeshin leaning against a building, arms folded across his chest, dark eyes watching the villagers as they moved about their lives. Naruto paused, very surprised to see him outside of the compound. None of the other Uchiha ever ventured beyond the gates of the compound, apparently satisfied to lament in their respected places. "What is it?" Sasuke asked, looking around, having stopped when he realized Naruto was no longer following him. His hand moved toward his pocket, where many of his kunai remained. "Nabeshin," Naruto whispered, and the ghost looked over at him, as if hearing his words above the noise of the village. He broke into a grin and headed toward them, looking strangely relieved. Several villagers walked right through him, jumping, or shaking their heads at the sensation, though Nabeshin didn't seem to notice. "There you are," the Uchiha clearly sounded relieved, pale rusted puffs coming from his mouth. "I was looking all over for you." "Where is he?" Sasuke asked, and Naruto made a quick gesture to where Nabeshin stood. Sasuke stared at the area, squinting, trying hard to see where his relative was, but seeing nothing. "Let's go," he ordered, and they quickly moved toward the compound, Nabeshin following after them. "Tell me everything he says to you." Nabeshin sent Sasuke a curious look. "You do everything he tells you to?" he asked Naruto, who simply hunched his shoulders and said nothing. When they entered the compound, the other Uchiha lifted and turned their heads in his direction, watching as they headed for the main house. "When you didn't show up for training, I went to look for you," Nabeshin commented, and Naruto reluctantly repeated the words to Sasuke, who looked intrigued. He paused at the porch of the main house as they stepped inside, and Naruto balked at the dust that floated in the air. Just as he headed for the kitchen to gather cleaning supplies, Sasuke's mother chose that moment to enter, mouth open, dark eyes trained on Sasuke. Naruto quickly turned and rushed up to their room, shutting the door quickly and sitting in his corner, head in his hands. He was afraid to sleep, more than he usually was, because they were angry with him, and he could not bear to feel their eyes on him. Ever since he had jumped in front of Sasuke and had taken his blows, they had been torturing him. His head ached constantly with their fury, his stomach cramped, body shook, vision blurred. Something dropped in his lap and he moved his hands from his eyes to see that it was a candy bar. He nudged it away, knowing that the villagers had seen him with Sasuke when he had purchased them. It was over now, he couldn't eat them anymore, or the soup for that matter. "Eat it, Naruto. You haven't eaten for days." Sasuke put the candy bar back in his lap. Naruto shook his head. "It's poisoned now. They saw me with you." "Don't be stupid," Sasuke snapped, removing his shirt. "They couldn't have poisoned it with me right there, buying them. Besides, you stood outside, no one notices you, so eat it." Naruto wrung his fingers in agitation, but he opened the candy bar and ate it, knowing that Sasuke was right, and wishing his head didn't hurt so much that it ruined reasonable thinking. "Huh," a voice came, and he looked up to see that Nabeshin was in the room, looking around. "I've never been in this house before." He looked down at him, then averted his eyes. "It's weird, but ever since I started training you, I've been." He shook his head. "It had never occurred to me to leave the compound before. But when you didn't show up, I was compelled to look for you." Naruto looked in Sasuke's direction. He was changing out of his shorts. "It's interesting the stuff you hear when no one knows you're around," the ghost said, eyes sparkling. "Nabeshin says he's heard some stuff," Naruto said to Sasuke, whose head darted up in surprise, eyes moving about the room. "What's he heard?" "Well, there's a Chunin exam coming within the month, and apparently the Kazekage is going to be present. There'll be ninja from all over, interesting people." Naruto repeated his words. "Chunin exam." He seemed puzzled. Naruto rubbed agitated eyes. "The Chunin exam is used to show off the young talent of each village, and a way to avoid war. The other is to assess and promote genin to Chunin level." A Jonin can enter his team after they've completed 8 to 10 successful missions. Nabeshin nodded cheerfully. Sasuke's eyes burned with interest, and he knew he was mentally counting the number of missions they had done. Do you think Kakashi-sensei will allow us to enter? Naruto shook his head. He hoped not. He didn't want to be a Chunin. He didn't want to have anything to do with exams, where people watched him, thought about him, talked about him. He shuddered. Nabeshin shook his head. It's so strange, it never occurred to me to leave the compound before meeting you, and suddenly, such an urge to find you. Where'd you go anyway? When his students were out of sight, Kakashi turned back into the room and moved back in front of the Hokage. How did it go? The Sandaime asked, dark eyes scanning his face intensely. Kakashi sighed, shaking his head. Where do I start? He looked up at the ceiling. I've seen behavior that concerns me, behavior that may get him or the rest of the team killed. Does he suffer from schizophrenia? Any other mental disorder you failed to mention? The newspaper on the walls, talking to himself. I've seen the state of his body, and he's near starvation. Sandaime steepled his fingers together and gazed out the window. Believe it or not, he's in better condition than before. Since Sasuke's unexpected arrival, his condition has improved drastically. Kakashi's brow rose in disbelief. Have you ever had him evaluated by a professional? Institutionalized. Sarutobi smiled, wrinkles multiplying. I had the same talk with Umino-san several years ago. Can you imagine Naruto within the hands of strangers? He would kill himself, I think. He wouldn't be able to survive in a controlled environment like that. He's incredibly stubborn. Naruto thrives in an environment he can control, and Sasuke may think that he has control over him, but if the boy took a step back and looked at it from a different eye, he would see that it is he that is being controlled. It was true. He had observed Sasuke's behavior when it came to Naruto. How many times he had heard Sasuke say, Naruto doesn't like it. Sasuke accommodated Naruto, changing many of his habits to mirror the blonde's. I've never tried to make him take medication, because I could never get him to eat. I can't imagine how Sasuke had conquered that feat. His face darkened. But he is your student now, Kakashi. Do what you think is best for him. Kakashi gave another heavy sigh. And what was best? Having ventured out of the compound, it seemed that Nabeshin was reluctant to be left behind. He followed them on missions. They were back to the mundane ones, and had a snide comment for everything, words that only Naruto could hear and never bothered to repeat. He noticed his dark eyes seemed to grow more bitter as the days had gone by, most often directed towards the villagers. He watched them with cold eyes, following them as they moved obliviously about their lives, not unlike a predator watching prey. Nabeshin's silent simmering made him nervous and uneasy, and he found that avoiding the ghost was all but impossible. The only place the ghost didn't go was the bathroom, and understandably, the room where Sasuke's father dwelt. I'd be pissed too, if my son wiped out my entire clan too, the little traitor. This was said when Sasuke had tried to make him go back into the room. He had flat out refused, and no amount of pushing, pulling, or threats could change his mind. Nabeshin had watched this with a frown, eyes darting between the two as they struggled in front of the door, Sasuke pulling him, and Naruto flopping to the floor, using his body weight to thwart the Uchiha's efforts. Sasuke had found a deeper use for Nabeshin. Ever since the ghost had mentioned the Chunin exams, the Uchiha had been sending him out to gather information on everyone who was entering. Nabeshin returned with tales of Grass Ninja, Sound Ninja, Mist Ninja, and Sand Ninja, which he felt would be of particular interest to Naruto. He's a Jinchuriki like you, the dead Uchiha claimed, waiting for his reaction. But this was not news to him. He knew there were others and had absolutely no desire to meet them. He really didn't want to meet anyone in general. Sasuke seemed alarmed though. Who is he? What does he look like? His name is Gaara and he's got red hair, rings around his eyes, and a big jar thing on his back. He's not very friendly either. Sasuke's eyes narrowed in silent speculation. Stay away from him, he commanded. Lately most of what he said was a command. Naruto's response was to ignore him and continue to do what he was doing, which was cleaning the house. He and his clones tended to make quick work of the house, something that seemed to fascinate Nabeshin. He watched the clones as they worked, Naruto knew this because when the clones dissipated he knew that they noticed the ghost. His eyes had turned shrewd and thoughtful. What did he want? Days went by, he and Naruto returned to their usual routine of D-rank missions, though he chafed at them. He wanted another high-ranking mission, and he didn't want to clean houses, retrieve animals, paint fences, or plant vegetables. Naruto had no problems doing any of these things. Sasuke himself spent many nights mulling over whether Kakashi-sensei was going to enter them into the exam. He sent Nabeshin out to spy on Team 8 and 10, discovering that Yuhikure Nai was speculating it. Nabeshin had followed her home to find this out. There was something else he discovered. Nabeshin would not listen to him unless Naruto was the one giving the commands. He had discovered this when he had waited for the ghost to return with news of Sarutobi Asuma's decision and hadn't received any. Has Nabeshin returned yet? He had asked one night before he had gone to bed. Naruto had blinked up blearily at him, having not slept in 3 days and having a harder time understanding him because of it. The blonde had then glanced at the door. He never left, he had murmured, surprising him. What do you mean? I told him to follow Team 10 to see if they're going to be in the exam. Naruto had shrugged, leaning over the book he was reading. He says he doesn't have to do what you say. What about you? Does he have to do what you say? He'd long gotten over the idea that the whole compound was filled with relatives he could not see. It turned out Nabeshin had, because the next day Naruto had said randomly that it was unknown whether Sarutobi-sensei was going to nominate Team 10. Ever since Nabeshin had become their spy, it at first was confusing. He didn't know if Naruto was talking to him or just repeating the ghost's words, especially when he had stopped saying Nabeshin says. In the end, he had to settle for knowing that anything longer than half a sentence was Nabeshin's words. Lately he had been thinking beyond Konoha. Actually he had been thinking about Haku. Haku had been tougher than them, more powerful than he had thought a kid his age could be, despite having Itachi for an elder brother. It made him think that there was much more to learn outside of Konoha than there was inside of it. Training was moving too slow here, for him and Naruto, and he wanted to learn more than Kakashi-sensei was teaching them. Sakura glanced ahead at her teammates glumly, feeling another wave of depression fall over her. Ever since they had returned from Wave, each day had been more miserable than the day before. It appeared that Sasuke and Naruto had forgotten her. They rarely talked to her, interacting only enough to get the missions done, and Naruto didn't interact at all. It was hurtful and frustrating. She had tried to change, being more serious during training, practicing things she had never cared to do in the academy. Kakashi-sensei continued to help her with her endurance, building up more chakra, working on her kunai skills. She wanted to show them that she was useful, that she wasn't just a girl, but it seemed they had forgotten her. It was like the academy all over again, and she still couldn't help but to blame Naruto for this. Naruto came to a stop quite suddenly, but this time she halted before bumping into him. His hooded head was always bowed, his gaze, from what she could tell, was usually focused on the ground, and she often wondered how he managed to not walk into Sasuke, especially since he walked so closely to him. His head lifted slowly, she could see 2 blue eyes under his hair, and they were focused on something across the street. Sasuke turned back, his sharp dark eyes scanning the area and falling on someone. Sakura turned to look, spotting a small group across the street. Immediately she saw that they were Sannin by their Hitai, one a redhead with shadowed green eyes, a girl with sandy blonde hair, and another boy with purple paint lining his face. The redhead was giving her the creeps. She could feel his killing intent from the other side of the street, his eyes focused on Naruto. She looked at the hooded blonde, and for once he didn't look his usual miserable. Instead his face was empty, red-rimmed eyes trained solely on the Sunanin. The moment became more uncomfortable, for both boys hadn't moved and it seemed the others weren't going to either except the purple-faced boy, who was steadily looking more pissed. Then Naruto gave a jerk, his eyelids fluttering until he lowered his head and turned to continue heading toward their meeting place. Sasuke paused to give the Sunanin another cold glance before he too moved on. Sakura remained, trying to puzzle out the animosity. Maybe it was a guy thing? Coming, Sakura. His voice startled her. She turned to see Sasuke and Naruto waiting for her. They were waiting for her. She still existed. She quickly followed the boys as they headed for the bridge, feeling like she could take on any challenge. That's it for part 4. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.